When it comes to painting, repetitively going through the same steps quickly destroys my motivation. It's one of the reasons I love Mythic Battles so much. There is so much variety in the miniatures, and you rarely paint the same thing twice. Even so, it's easy to get to a point with miniature painting where you plateau and rely on the same trusted methods to reach near identical results every time. If our skills are to improve, it's important to occasionally break away from our usual techniques and try different approaches. Take Hector for example. I knew when I sat down to paint this model that I could go the easy road. Some standard skin and metallics, a half-decent generic brown leather technique on the armour, and boom, miniature painted. But there was no part of me that felt enthusiastic about that. So I experimented, and this video is about the results of that experiment. If you're interested in painting red leather instead of brown, or trying out some rusty weapons, I think you'll enjoy this one. More generally, I hope it will inspire you to take some chances with your painting style when you paint your next model. But make no mistake, when trying something new, there is always the chance that things won't go exactly to plan. As usual, I removed mould lines, transferred the model to a scenic base, and used a zenithal prime on the miniature before starting to paint. If you're not sure what zenithal priming is, check out my 5 tools video where I explain the process in some detail, along with a number of other terms and techniques I'll talk about in this video. If you've watched many of my painting videos, you'll probably guess where I'm going to start. The eyes are painted carefully, filling the eye socket with any white paint, and once this is dry, which won't take long, adding a dot of black to the upper centre of the white you have just painted. Did I fuss around with this a few times during the course of the paint process? Absolutely I did, but it still saves me some stress to get this detail sorted prior to painting the skin. The technique I used on Hector's skin is very similar to the process I used for Moreira, so I'll cover it only briefly in this video. The biggest difference was I started with a slightly darker tone by mixing Vallejo Game Colour Dark Flesh Tone and Game Colour Tan as the base coat. I then progressively added highlights to this base coat, painting a little less of the skin each time based on where the light would be brightest, starting with just Game Colour Tan, then adding in some Vallejo Panzer Aces Flesh base, and eventually even adding a touch of Panzer Aces Highlights Flesh for the brightest highlight. As a final step, I added some further shadow by selectively applying Army Painter Quick Shade Strong Tone relatively thinly to areas that would be in the shade, and also to emphasise certain features of the face and outline other areas of the model, like the hair, clothing, and the leather straps of the sandals that are adjacent to the skin. It's worth remembering that although this takes some time, the face is a major focal point of the model. Well-painted skin can therefore elevate an otherwise average model, and it's an aspect of painting that is well worth practicing. Hector's armour would look amazing using a variety of leather techniques, but having recently seen similar attire in red leather at a historical reenactment, I wanted to experiment painting red leather specifically. To start with, I thinned scale colour red leather and painted it over all areas I wanted to look like leather, including the sandals. And yes, I know what you're thinking. What's that, Victor? Use paint called red leather to paint red leather? How do you come up with these amazing tutorials? Well, firstly, sarcasm is the lowest form of wit. And secondly, whilst painting a thin coat of red leather over the zenithal prime certainly produced a better starting point than I was expecting, I wanted to experiment with some colour variation in the leather, rather than leaving it a flat single colour. To do this, I mixed 3 alternative shades of the base colour on my palette. The first was a mix of red leather and some of the Panzer Aces Flesh highlights already on the palette to create a highlight. The second combined the base colour with model colour flat brown for a shadow tone. And lastly I mixed game colour gory red with the base colour to produce a more vibrant version of the leather colour. I then started to apply these tones to the individual patches of armour. Broadly, I used the darker mix on the sides of the armour, where there would be natural shadow from Hector's arms, and the highlighted tone on upper areas and the edges of the leather squares, with the redmost tone being a sort of accent colour between them. The effect is quite subtle on this small model, and I think if I did this again, I'd probably be even more bold and add in orange colours or perhaps beige colours to the mix to create some more dramatic variation. That said, I was quite happy with the result. As a final highlight on the armour, I added even more highlights flesh to the lightest tone from the previous step, and focused on just those elements of the leather that were sticking out or in light, particularly the very tips of the individual squares. I also used this tone to selectively highlight the sandal straps. I then increased the contrast by creating a thin glaze of scale colour black leather and applying this between the individual squares and anywhere the shadows would be at their deepest. During the process, I also painted Hector's sleeves, which are not part of the leather armour, using a brighter red colour in order to differentiate but at the same time complement the leather areas. Having a vibrant red so close to the leather areas makes the armour appear duller, helping to sell these areas as leather rather than a red fabric. For a first attempt at a new style of armour, I'm pretty happy with the result. There's definite scope to refine it further, but it's a shade of leather that I haven't seen very often in wargaming, and it really makes Hector stand out from the other leather-heavy models in my collection. Don't be afraid to experiment and alter tried and tested techniques when you are painting. Doing so will only increase your enjoyment of the painting process. My technique for painting bronze has changed a lot over time, but I've reached a point where I'm pretty happy with it, and you'll see me use this approach a lot on Mythic Battles miniatures. Firstly, I thin Vallejo Game Colour Tinny Tin, and apply this to all the areas I want to paint bronze. Hector doesn't have a lot of metallic areas, but I did need to be quite careful that I didn't spill over onto the skin or leather that I'd already painted, as it would be problematic to fix. Most of the tinny tin will be covered by subsequent steps, but it forms both the outline and the shadows for the bronze areas. The next step is to apply scale colour Victorian brass, which I usually do via a dry brush. If you haven't tried this technique before, it basically involves wiping most of the paint onto a paper towel before brushing over the model, resulting in raised edges picking up the highlight and recessed areas remaining the base colour. This can also create a nice blend effect, especially using metallic paint, that would take much more effort to achieve with other techniques. Hector's armour is so small, however, that I had to be exceedingly careful not to get metallic particles onto undesirable areas. Using a small brush that has lost its tip helped this process, and I used a more traditional edge highlight where necessary to avoid overspill. There are some more steps to finish these metallic areas, however I decided at this stage to move on to paint the shield, and then come back to finish the bronze. So began a comedy of indecision, failure and regret that easily doubled the remaining time I spent painting Hector. I promise to show you my missteps as well as my successes in these videos, so strap in. Before we get started, I wanted on record that this shield makes no sense to me at all. I'd welcome correction from any ancient historians out there, but this shield doesn't look very Greek to me. It seems to evoke a vaguely Celtic or Saxon feel that put me off simply painting it bronze and leaving it there. It also seems really odd that there's a decoration on both sides of the shield instead of just the outward face. Who on earth is that decoration supposed to impress in battle exactly? This confusion left me unsure how to proceed with the shield. I had already painted the metal areas with the rest of the bronze, thinking it would be easier to fill in the gaps, and I started by painting a dark red base coat using a mix of the gory red I used earlier and a touch of black. I then added pure gory red on top as a second coat. This doesn't look too bad on camera, but in person, even after a couple of careful coats, the result was quite patchy and I immediately disliked having so much bright colour overwhelming the rest of the model. This left me with a dilemma. I knew that repainting the shield to reach a point that I was happy with was going to massively increase the time I spent on this single model, but I also knew that if I didn't correct the shield, I would never want to look at this model ever again, so back we go. On the defensive face of the shield, which because of Hector's pose faces backwards, I tried to achieve a wet blend mixing gory red and the exceedingly dark game colour royal purple. Essentially I kept both paints quite diluted and applied the red towards the top of the shield with the purple at the bottom and blended the two together on the shield about halfway. My first go at this achieved 75% of what I was looking for, and I let this dry before playing with the effect further. On the other side, I applied a thin coat of scale colour black leather over the red, which gave the wood a vaguely mahogany tone. And then free-handed some planks to make the shield look like wood using thin scale colour walnut. I added a touch of the original red tone into my wood colours during this process in order to keep them complementary with the other colours already on the model. While these initial steps dried, I turned my attention to Hector's cape. Capes are always my favourite part of a model like this. Once you have some confidence painting and blending, you will find a big fabric area like this is quite quick to paint, and also incredibly satisfying. I settled on a dark blue-grey as it would provide a cold colour to contrast with the mostly warm tones on the model so far. Mixing model colour black-grey, which is a quite dark off-black colour, our Old Faithful bright turquoise from MSP's high-density pigment range, and white in various proportions in order to create shades and highlights. I applied a mid to dark base tone first so that my subsequent blends would have an underlying colour to enrich them. I then spent a happy few minutes playing with highlights, transitions and opacity until I arrived at something I was happy with. Moving quickly through this stage while your paints are still wet and using a larger brush makes the blending of different tones a doddle, and I achieved a result I was happy with on the front of the cape in mere seconds. Returning to the shield, I added scale colour birch to the wood tone on my palette and applied small streaks and curves to the planks to create the impression of a wood grain. I'll probably return to do a tutorial on wood grain at some point, as it's a surprisingly fun and fast thing to freehand. However, the key on this model was to apply the lines as thinly as possible and ensure the planks were fully covered but without covering the dividing lines. On the other side of the shield, I did a second thinner blend over the first to pull the purple hue further up the shield and to emphasise the red tone at the top of the shield. Having the first blend beneath this second coat made it much easier to complete. Of course, I then had to carefully repaint all the metallic flourishes with tinny tin before adding Victorian brass, as my revisions to the shield had completely covered the metallic paint I had applied previously. Once complete, it was time to finish all the bronze on the model by carefully applying scale colour moonstone alchemy to the most upturned or protruding areas of the armour. After this had dried, I enhanced the shadows and softened the transitions between the different metallic colours where necessary by applying a little strong tone in the recesses and shadows. With that, the shield was finally complete. Is it my favourite shield ever? No. Am I going to paint it a third time? Also no. While I was messing around with the shield, I'd started to wonder about the origins of Hector's weapons in the context of mythic battles. Presumably the Trojan prince would have been buried in his armour, but given the treatment of his body after his death, maybe his equipment had become lost, forcing him to take whatever he could find in the depths of the underworld. Perhaps that's why his shield makes no sense, not bitter though, and perhaps his sword, far from the master-crafted weapon of his first life, is battered and encrusted with corrosion. Surprisingly, given my fondness for all things undead, I haven't really dabbled with rust effects, so let's finish this video with a clang. I started by giving the sword a metallic base coat using scale colour black metal. Once this had been allowed to dry, I turned to a new product in my collection, Vallejo Game Effects Dry Rust. This plays a little like Typhus Corrosion from the Citadel range, which may be more familiar to some of you, in that it adds a subtle rust texture to the miniature in addition to being this gorgeous deep rust colour. I applied the texture paint over much of the blade, but I also used a little water on my brush to thin out some areas so that the metal still shows through slightly, while areas I thought would collect more moisture, such as the hilt, got a heavier coat. I don't recommend using your favourite brush for this in case the texture ruins it. I let the dry rust dry overnight and then applied thin and sparing stipples of Game Effects rust over some of the darker rust areas to create variation. If I'm entirely honest, I think rust is just a really nice, fairly thick rust coloured paint, rather than having any other qualities like dry rust's texture. These paints are obviously intended to be used together, but if you already have a good rust colour in your normal paint collection, I wouldn't necessarily rush out to buy this paint. What I ended up with wasn't too bad for a near first attempt at rust, but I softened the transitions by applying some selected shading using strong tone. Hector's sword can't be completely rusted or he'd have no use for it, and we can demonstrate the remaining sharpness of the blade by adding some Vallejo Game Colour Silver to the edges. This is a sort of patchy dry brush, just picking out the edges and point of the blade where I felt it made sense. Once done, I felt some of the silver was a little bright, so I decided to tarnish it by adding a thin layer of strong tone over the top. Barring a few details and painting the scenic base, Hector was finally, at last, complete. I present to you Hector in all his glory. Just to be clear, I never want to paint this miniature ever again. It's pretty clear that I should have established a plan for the shield when I decided on the main colour scheme, and not doing so cost me a lot of time and fuss. That said, there was something liberating about taking the safety wheels off and painting whole sections of this model using approaches that I was figuring out on the fly and that I had never used before. It's easy to fall into a rut painting miniatures, using the same colour combinations over and over because they worked before, and losing that first joy of stumbling into approaches you hadn't considered. Like Hector's shield, not every experiment is going to work out the way you plan. Like Hector's armour and sword, some will, and I think that's worth the risk. Thanks for joining my personal therapy session. We've got some great content coming over the next few months, so it's a great time to subscribe if you haven't already. To those that have, we salute you. It's really important to our young channel, and we're honoured that you're prepared to show your support in this way. Until we meet again, work hard, play better, and take care out there.